Strip off that uniform. You're a disgrace to everything it stands for. The mess hall fell into dead silence. Over 300 soldiers held their breath, waiting to witness a public takedown. But the woman in scrubs didn't flinch. No fear, no protest, just a steady gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the crowd at something only she could see. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the civilian contractor quietly dismissed for the past 3 months, stood like a statue, her breathing calm, her posture unshaken. The kind of stillness that only comes from surviving storms most wouldn't endure. She hadn't prepared for this exact moment, but for something like it, a reckoning. A collision between past and present where silence would no longer protect the truth, and what happened next would haunt them forever. But Sarah's reaction was not what anyone expected. No tears, no protests, no defensive posturing. She simply stood there, her hands steady at her sides, her breathing controlled, her eyes focused on something beyond the crowd that none of them could see. It was the kind of calm that comes not from weakness, but from having survived storms that would break most people, the kind of quiet that experienced soldiers recognize immediately, though none of them were looking for it in a woman wearing scrubs. What they could not know was that Sarah had been preparing for this moment for 5 years. Not this exact confrontation, but something like it. The moment when her two worlds would collide and she would have to choose between staying hidden and revealing the truth that had been buried in classified files and sleepless nights. The silence that followed was not defeat, it was preparation, and what happened next would haunt them forever. Fort Braxton Medical Training Command stood as one of the military's most elite facilities, where the finest combat medics learned to save lives under the most impossible conditions. The morning sun cast long shadows across the sprawling complex, its rays catching the polished boots of officers hurrying between buildings, their conversations a mixture of technical jargon and dark humor that only those who had seen real combat could fully appreciate. The hierarchy here was absolute, measured not just in rank but in combat patches, length of service, and the unspoken understanding that some experiences could never be explained to civilians. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had been working at Fort Braxton for 3 months as a civilian contractor, hired to teach advanced trauma care to the next generation of military medics. At 42, she appeared unremarkable among the sea of uniforms, her blonde hair always pulled back in a simple ponytail, her civilian scrubs a stark contrast to the crisp military bearing that surrounded her. She ate alone in the mess hall, arrived early to prepare her lessons, and left late after ensuring every piece of equipment was properly stored. To most observers, she was simply another contractor, temporary help brought in to fill gaps in the training schedule. But there were subtle signs that something did not quite fit. The way she moved through the corridors with unconscious precision, her steps falling into a rhythm that matched the military cadence even when she was not trying. The way her eyes automatically scanned rooms upon entering, assessing exits and potential threats with the speed of someone whose survival had once depended on such habits. And most telling of all, the way she wore a simple silver chain around her neck, its contents hidden beneath her scrubs, touched occasionally with the reverence reserved for sacred objects. What no one knew was that Sarah's evenings were haunted by more than just memories. She would return to her small apartment off base, where photographs of her late husband David covered every surface. David had been a Navy chaplain, killed in a convoy attack 3 months before her own deployment to Afghanistan. Their wedding ring, which she still wore on a chain beside her hidden dog tags, had become both her anchor and her burden. She would sit in David's old reading chair, surrounded by his books on theology and philosophy, trying to reconcile the faith he had lived by with the hell she had endured. The nightmares that woke her at 3 a.m. weren't just about the cave in Afghanistan. They were about the letter she had written to David the night before the attack, the letter he would never read, the forgiveness she desperately needed but could never receive. Colonel Marcus Webb represented everything the old guard believed military medicine should be, but his convictions came from a place of deep personal pain. At 55, he was a decorated combat veteran who had earned his position through years of field experience, but also through the crushing weight of lives he couldn't save. His office walls were covered with photographs from deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan, each image a testament not just to his dedication, but to his desperate need to prove that the 23 soldiers who had died under his care hadn't died in vain. His harsh treatment of contractors wasn't just institutional bias, it was the manifestation of a man who had never forgiven himself for the lives lost during his early career, when inexperience had cost him dearly. Webb's marriage had ended 2 years earlier, his wife citing his inability to leave the war behind. His children, now adults, barely spoke to him. The bourbon he kept in his desk drawer was testimony to the demons he fought daily. His hostility towards civilian contractors stemmed from a twisted logic. If military medicine was sacred, then anyone who hadn't earned their knowledge through blood and loss was somehow stealing valor from those who had. Sarah's competence threatened not just his authority, but his entire worldview about suffering and sacrifice. The gender dynamics at Fort Braxton were complex and often unspoken, but they weren't monolithic. Captain Elena Rodriguez, a 34-year-old trauma surgeon who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, watched the subtle undermining of Sarah with growing concern. Elena had fought her own battles for respect in the male-dominated medical corps, and she recognized the signs of institutional bias that went beyond simple military hierarchy. Unlike her male colleagues, she noticed how Sarah's suggestions were attributed to others in meetings, how her expertise was questioned in ways that male contractors never experienced. Elena had her own complicated relationship with Sarah's presence. As one of the few women in senior medical positions, she had worked twice as hard to prove herself, and part of her resented Sarah's quiet competence. But Elena also recognized something familiar in Sarah's bearing: the hypervigilance, the controlled breathing, the way she unconsciously positioned herself near exits. Elena had seen it in her own mirror for years after her last deployment. The other staff members began to notice inconsistencies in Sarah's background. She referenced medical protocols from deployment zones that were not part of standard training curricula. Her knowledge of field medicine was encyclopedic, extending far beyond what any civilian should know. She spoke of traumatic injuries with the casual familiarity of someone who had treated them repeatedly, her descriptions too vivid and specific to have come from textbooks alone. Senior non-commissioned officers, men who had spent careers learning to read people under pressure, sometimes paused when Sarah spoke. They recognized something in her voice, a quality that could not be taught or faked. Sergeant Major Thompson, a medic with 4 combat deployments, found himself unconsciously deferring to her expertise during training exercises. But these moments of recognition were fleeting, dismissed as coincidence or imagination. After all, she was just a contractor, temporary help, who would be gone once her contract expired. Yet Sarah absorbed every slight without visible reaction. When her opinions were dismissed, she simply continued her work. When her teaching materials were moved or misplaced, she adapted without complaint. When conversations stopped as she approached, she maintained her professional demeanor and focused on her mission. Her silence was not submission, but strategy, the behavior of someone who had learned to conserve energy for battles that truly mattered. But the silence was costing her. Each night she would call her sister Jennifer, a teacher in Ohio who had become her lifeline to the civilian world. Jennifer was the only person who knew about Sarah's nightmares, her struggles with PTSD, her desperate need to prove she could still save lives. "You don't have to carry this alone," Jennifer would say during their late-night conversations. "David wouldn't want you to suffer like this." But Sarah couldn't explain that her silence at Fort Braxton wasn't about suffering. It was about finding a way to honor David's memory while healing her own wounds. The tension had been building for weeks, small incidents accumulating like pressure in a sealed container. Sarah's unflappable competence seemed to irritate Colonel Webb more each day, her quiet confidence challenging his assumptions about what civilian contractors could offer to military medicine. He had begun to take her presence personally, viewing her success as an implicit criticism of his methods and beliefs. Captain Rodriguez watched the deteriorating situation with growing alarm. She had tried to intervene subtly, suggesting to Webb that Sarah's methods might be worth examining, but her attempts only seemed to fuel his resentment. Elena found herself caught between professional solidarity and institutional loyalty, unsure how to support Sarah without jeopardizing her own position. But Colonel Webb was about to make the biggest mistake of his career. What happened next would expose a secret that had been buried for 5 years. The main training amphitheater at Fort Braxton could hold 300 personnel, and on this particular Tuesday morning, every seat was filled. Sarah stood at the podium, her presentation slides displaying advanced trauma care techniques that she had refined through methods none of them could imagine. Her voice was steady and professional as she explained the intricacies of treating penetrating chest wounds in field conditions, her hands moving with practiced precision as she demonstrated each procedure on the training mannequin. Captain Rodriguez sat in the third row, taking notes not on the techniques, she knew most of them already, but on the subtle innovations Sarah had incorporated. The way she modified standard procedures to account for limited resources, the psychological techniques she used to maintain focus under pressure, the efficiency of movement that came from someone who had performed these procedures when every second counted. Elena found herself wondering where Sarah had learned these methods, and why a civilian contractor would know combat medicine this intimately. Colonel Webb entered the amphitheater halfway through her presentation, his heavy boots echoing against the concrete steps as he made his way to the front row. His presence immediately shifted the atmosphere, conversations stopping as junior officers straightened in their seats. Sarah noticed his arrival but continued her lesson without pause, her focus remaining on the life-saving techniques she was teaching. This was her domain, the one place where her expertise could not be questioned or dismissed. But Webb had not come to observe. He had come to make a point, to demonstrate once and for all that civilian contractors had no place in military medicine. His voice cut through her explanation like a blade. This is real military medicine, not some civilian textbook theory. The amphitheater fell silent, 300 pairs of eyes turning between the colonel and the contractor, sensing the confrontation that was about to unfold. Sarah paused, her hands still positioned over the training mannequin, and looked directly at Webb for the first time. Her expression remained neutral, but something flickered in her eyes, not fear, but a weary recognition of a battle she had hoped to avoid. "Colonel, I understand your concerns, but these techniques have been proven effective in combat situations." Her voice carried no defensiveness, no anger, just the quiet confidence of someone stating facts. Webb stepped closer to the podium, his chest ribbons catching the overhead lights as he positioned himself to address not just Sarah but the entire audience. "Proven by whom? Have you ever seen real blood, real casualties? Have you ever had to make life or death decisions while rounds are flying overhead?" His questions weren't entirely rhetorical, they carried the weight of his own failures, the memories of soldiers he couldn't save, the desperate need to prove that suffering gave meaning to knowledge. Captain Rodriguez felt her stomach tighten as she watched the confrontation unfold. She had seen Webb's pattern before, the way he used his authority to crush anything that challenged his worldview, but something was different this time. Sarah's composure wasn't just professional. It was the kind of calm that came from having survived tests that would break most people. The atmosphere in the amphitheater had transformed from educational to gladiatorial. Sarah found herself completely isolated, 300 military personnel watching as their colonel systematically dismantled her credibility. No one spoke in her defense. No one questioned his methods. The institutional hierarchy was absolute, and she was clearly on the wrong side of it. But Sarah's response was not what anyone expected. She did not defend herself. She did not list her qualifications or demand respect. Instead, she simply stood there, her breathing controlled, her posture erect, her eyes focused on something beyond the crowd that none of them could see. It was the kind of calm that comes not from innocence, but from having survived storms that would break most people. The kind of quiet that experienced soldiers recognize immediately, though none of them were looking for it in a woman wearing scrubs. In that moment, Sarah was not thinking about Webb or the crowd or even her own humiliation. She was thinking about David, about the letter she had written him the night before the attack, about the promise she had made to honor his memory by saving lives. She was thinking about the 4 soldiers in that Afghan cave, about the choice between hiding and healing, about the weight of carrying truth alone. Webb interpreted her silence as capitulation and pressed his advantage. Women playing soldier while real men die in foreign countries. Civilian contractors pretending to know combat medicine while collecting paychecks they haven't earned. His words carried the weight of institutional authority, but also the bitterness of his own losses, each syllable designed to strip away her credibility and reduce her to what he believed she truly was, an outsider who had no business wearing anything that resembled a uniform. Captain Rodriguez felt something snap inside her. She had endured similar attacks throughout her career, had watched other women destroyed by the same institutional bias, but something about Sarah's dignity in the face of this assault, her refusal to fight back or defend herself, made Elena's silence feel like complicity. She started to rise from her seat, her mouth opening to speak, when the doors at the back of the amphitheater burst open. The crowd's psychology had shifted to mob mentality, individual conscience surrendering to group dynamics. Junior officers who had respected Sarah's teaching now avoided eye contact. Medical staff who had learned from her expertise suddenly found reasons to question her methods. The dehumanization was complete. Sarah transformed from colleague to other, from teacher to target. Then Webb delivered his ultimatum. Strip that uniform off. You are a disgrace to everything it stands for. The words echoed through the amphitheater with the finality of a verdict. 300 people held their breath, waiting to witness what they believed would be a simple humiliation, the removal of a pretender who had dared to wear the appearance of military bearing. Sarah looked directly at Webb, her expression unreadable. For a moment, she seemed to be weighing something in her mind, making a choice that would change everything. Slowly, deliberately, she began to remove her medical coat, her movements precise and controlled. The crowd leaned forward, anticipating victory, expecting submission, but as the coat slipped from her shoulders, something underneath caught the light, something that changed everything. General Patricia Hayes, the base commander, strode into the room with the bearing of someone who had just witnessed the unthinkable. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with recognition as she took in the scene before her. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the authority of absolute command. Colonel Webb, stand down. Now. The room froze. Webb turned, confusion replacing confidence as he faced his superior officer. General Hayes's eyes were fixed not on him, but on Sarah, and in that gaze was a recognition that no one else in the room could understand. Sarah had removed her silver chain, the dog tags catching the overhead lights, and suddenly, the general's voice cracked with an emotion that 300 people could not place. "You have no idea who you are talking to," General Hayes said, her words carrying the weight of classified knowledge and personal history. But the truth about Sarah's past was darker than anyone imagined. What Captain Rodriguez was about to discover would change everything she thought she knew about heroism. What Webb was about to learn would haunt him for the rest of his career. General Hayes stepped forward, her voice carrying the weight of classified memories and personal witness. Operation Red Wing, Helmand Province, 2019. The words fell like stones into still water, each syllable rippling through the amphitheater with implications that no one yet understood. Elite medical unit, 15-person team, hostile territory. Their mission was to establish a forward medical station in what intelligence believed was a secured zone. The crowd shifted, sensing that something fundamental was about to change. Webb's confidence wavered as he recognized the operation name from classified briefings, reports that had been sealed at the highest levels of command. Sarah remained perfectly still, her dog tags catching the overhead lights, her expression revealing nothing of the memories that General Hayes was about to resurrect. Captain Rodriguez felt her heart racing as pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed began to fall into place. Operation Red Wing. She had heard whispers about it in the medical corps, stories that were never officially confirmed, a unit that had gone dark for 72 hours before extraction. The official reports had been classified above her clearance level, but rumors had circulated about heroic actions and impossible medical procedures performed under fire. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell was the lead trauma surgeon, General Hayes continued, her voice cracking slightly with emotion. At 37, she was the youngest officer ever to hold that position in a forward deployment. Her team respected her not just for her surgical skills, but for her ability to remain calm under fire, to make impossible decisions when every second counted. The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. Lieutenant Colonel. The title hung in the air, transforming everything they thought they knew about the woman standing before them. Webb's face drained of color as he began to understand the magnitude of his mistake. The institutional hierarchy suddenly inverted in ways that made his accusations not just wrong, but unthinkable. But even as the room reeled from this revelation, Captain Rodriguez noticed something else. Sarah's hands were trembling slightly, the first crack in her composure that Elena had ever seen. This wasn't just about revealing her rank or her service, this was about exposing wounds that had never properly healed. General Hayes's voice grew stronger as she continued the story, each detail painting a picture of heroism that none of them had imagined. On the 15th day of deployment, their convoy was hit by a coordinated attack, improvised explosive devices followed by sustained gunfire from elevated positions. 8 killed instantly, 4 critically wounded, Sarah and 2 others missing and presumed dead. The amphitheater had become a cathedral of silence, 300 people absorbing the weight of sacrifice they had never suspected. Sarah slowly rolled up her sleeves, revealing scars that told stories more eloquent than any words. Bullet wounds, 3 precise entry points surrounded by surgical precision repairs. Shrapnel marks riddling her forearms, healed metal fragments creating a map of violence survived. Chemical burns from makeshift surgery, evidence of medical procedures performed under conditions that would break most people. When the attack ended, Sarah dragged 4 wounded soldiers to a cave system approximately 2 kilometers from the ambush site, General Hayes testified, her words now flowing with the precision of an after-action report. For 72 hours, without extraction, without backup, under constant threat of enemy patrol, she performed surgery with nothing but a field medical kit and her own determination. Webb's growing horror was visible to everyone in the room. Recognition dawned in his eyes as he began to remember classified reports he had read, stories that had seemed too incredible to be true. His hands shook as he realized the connections forming in his mind, each realization adding weight to the crushing understanding of what he had done. Sarah operated on a collapsed lung with a penlight held between her teeth. General Hayes continued, her voice now thick with emotion. She performed 3 separate surgeries simultaneously, rotating between patients every few minutes to keep them all alive. When her blood supply ran out, she used her own, continuing to work even as her own strength failed. The crowd was transfixed, but Captain Rodriguez found herself watching Sarah's face more than listening to the general's words. She saw the way Sarah's breathing had become more controlled, the way she touched the dog tags around her neck like a talisman. Elena recognized the signs of someone fighting to stay present, to not disappear into the memories that were being dragged into the light. Sarah's first extended speech came quietly, her voice carrying the weight of experience that no one in the room could challenge. "I didn't come back to prove anything," she said, her words cutting through the silence like a prayer. "I came back to teach what I learned in that cave. Every soldier deserves to come home. I'm just trying to honor the ones who didn't." The last sentence broke something in her voice, a crack that revealed the pain she had been carrying alone. Captain Rodriguez understood suddenly that this wasn't just about military service or heroism. It was about survival, about finding meaning in loss, about the impossible burden of living when others had died. The room's atmosphere shifted like a tide turning. Shame settled on those who had participated in the mockery, respect building in officers who were beginning to understand what they were truly seeing. Sergeant Major Thompson stood suddenly, his voice cracking with recognition. "Ma'am, you saved my squad leader in Kandahar. The techniques you taught him, he used them on 3 of my men." Other voices joined in, a chorus of validation that Sarah's impact had rippled through the military medical community in ways she had never known. Webb's breakdown began with a whisper that carried across the silent amphitheater. "My God, what have I done?" But even as he spoke, part of him struggled to accept what he was hearing. 20 years of military service, of believing that respect was earned through visible sacrifice, of thinking that anyone who hadn't walked his path couldn't understand his pain. The woman standing before him had endured more than he had ever imagined, but accepting that meant questioning everything he had built his identity upon. Captain Rodriguez moved closer to Sarah, her own training in trauma recognition telling her that the woman was close to a breaking point. "Ma'am," she said quietly, "would you like to sit down?" It was a simple gesture, but it broke the spell of isolation that had surrounded Sarah since the confrontation began. General Hayes revealed the final truth with the solemnity of a memorial service. Sarah was awarded the Medal of Honor while unconscious in a military hospital. She spent 18 months in recovery, not just from her physical wounds, but from the psychological trauma of watching good soldiers die while she fought to save whoever she could. When she was finally discharged, a clerical error listed her as missing in action rather than medically retired. It took 5 years to correct the paperwork. The revelation about the Medal of Honor should have been the climax of vindication, but Sarah's reaction was unexpected. Instead of pride or satisfaction, her face showed something closer to grief. "The medal was for my unit," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For the soldiers who died in that convoy. I just happened to survive." Captain Rodriguez recognized the survivor's guilt in those words, the way Sarah carried the weight of every life lost as a personal failure. Webb's transformation was visible but incomplete. The man who had spent his career believing that military medicine was sacred, that suffering gave meaning to knowledge, now faced the reality that his own pain paled in comparison to what Sarah had endured. But decades of ingrained thinking don't disappear in a moment. Part of him still struggled to reconcile the competent contractor with the decorated war hero, still questioned whether his own failures in the field made him less worthy of respect. Sarah opened her medical bag, revealing surgical instruments that had been modified and refined through methods learned in impossible circumstances. "This is how you save a life with nothing," she said simply, her hands moving with practiced precision over tools that had been forged in the crucible of combat medicine. The demonstration that followed was not just instruction, but testimony to the kind of innovation that emerges when death is the only alternative. But even as the room watched in awe, Captain Rodriguez noticed that Sarah's hands were still trembling slightly. The cost of this exposure, of having her carefully constructed civilian life stripped away, was enormous. Elena made a decision that would define the rest of her career. She would stand with Sarah, not just as a colleague, but as someone who understood the unique challenges faced by women in military medicine. The transformation happening in that room was incredible, but it was neither complete nor unanimous. Some officers remained skeptical, their worldview too deeply ingrained to change in a single moment. Others struggled with the implications of what they had witnessed, unsure how to reconcile their treatment of Sarah with their own sense of honor and duty. But Sarah wasn't finished. What she was about to demonstrate would cement her legend with some, while leaving others forever changed by doubt and self-questioning, because sometimes the most profound lessons come from the deepest wounds, and not everyone is ready to learn them. Sarah's hands moved with surgical precision as she set up the demonstration, her movements carrying the fluid grace of someone who had performed these procedures under the most extreme conditions imaginable. The volunteer from the audience, a young medic named Private Collins, lay on the training table as Sarah explained the scenario. Simulated gunshot wound to the chest, arterial bleeding, no advanced medical equipment available, just the basic field kit that every medic carried into combat. Captain Rodriguez positioned herself where she could watch both Sarah and the crowd, her medical training helping her recognize the signs of someone pushing through trauma to teach. Sarah's voice was steady, but Elena noticed the way she paused occasionally, as if listening to voices only she could hear. The ghosts of that Afghan cave were present in the room, and Sarah was fighting to stay focused on the present. 300 medical professionals watched in complete silence as Sarah began her master class in impossible medicine. Using a simple pen tube, she created an emergency airway. With a standard issue belt, she fashioned a tourniquet that controlled bleeding with mathematical precision. Every movement was deliberate, every decision explained with the calm authority of someone who had made these choices when failure meant death. "Pain is temporary, but death is permanent," Sarah said quietly as she worked, her voice carrying the weight of experience that no textbook could provide. "Use what you have, not what you wish you had. Every soldier is someone's son or daughter. Your job is to bring them home." The words were simple, but they carried the gravity of truth learned in the crucible of combat, wisdom paid for with blood and sleepless nights. The room had transformed, but not uniformly. Medical staff were taking notes with the intensity of students learning from a master. Senior officers who had dismissed her hours earlier now leaned forward, recognizing expertise that transcended rank and protocol. Even the most hardened combat veterans in the audience found themselves moved by the demonstration of skills that had been refined in the hell of combat medicine. But Webb's response was complex and troubling. He watched the demonstration with growing recognition. These were techniques he had seen used, innovations that had saved lives in units he had served with. The realization that Sarah had developed these methods, that her knowledge had been propagated through the military medical system without recognition, should have filled him with respect. Instead, it filled him with a bitter mixture of admiration and resentment. If she was this skilled, this experienced, why hadn't she worn her service on her sleeve? Why had she let him make a fool of himself? Webb's personal reckoning began with a whisper that carried across the silent amphitheater. "My brother, Corporal James Webb, was one of the 4 you saved." His voice cracked with emotion as the full weight of his actions crashed down on him. The woman he had publicly humiliated, the hero he had tried to destroy, was the reason his brother had come home, had married, had given Webb nephews and nieces he adored. The collective attitude shift was profound, but not universal. Shame cascaded through some of the ranks as officers realized they had witnessed the systematic destruction of a national hero. Professional awe replaced mockery as many began to understand the level of expertise they were witnessing. But others struggled with the implications, their own military identities threatened by the recognition of civilian heroism. Sarah's response to Webb's breakdown was a masterclass in grace under pressure, but Captain Rodriguez could see the cost it was taking. "I understand your perspective," she said simply, her voice carrying no anger, no bitterness, just the quiet understanding of someone who had learned to see beyond the surface of human behavior. "The uniform means everything to you. I'm not here for recognition, I'm here to save the next generation." But even as she spoke, Elena noticed the way Sarah's hand moved unconsciously to her throat, touching the space where her wedding ring hung, hidden beneath her scrubs. This wasn't just about military service. It was about a woman trying to honor her dead husband's memory while healing her own wounds. The complexity of her motivations was something the crowd couldn't fully grasp. The demonstration reached its climax as Sarah performed an advanced technique that should have been impossible with field equipment: cardiac massage through an improvised incision, using tools that had been modified through combat necessity. The patient was technically unsavable by conventional standards, but Sarah's methods, refined through desperate necessity, achieved the impossible. The room erupted in thunderous applause, but it was fractured, some genuine admiration, some guilt-driven overcompensation, some confusion about how to process what they had witnessed. The institutional change was immediate, but incomplete. General Hayes offered Sarah the civilian equivalent of a full colonel's position, complete with the authority and resources to revolutionize military medical training. Sergeant Thompson requested immediate transfer to Sarah's unit. Captain Johnson asked to co-develop a new training program based on her methods. A queue of medical staff formed, each wanting to learn from the woman they had dismissed hours earlier. But not everyone was ready to change. Some officers remained skeptical, whispering among themselves about the dramatic timing of the revelation, questioning whether Sarah's methods were truly superior to established protocols. Others struggled with the implications for their own careers, wondering how many other civilian contractors might be hiding military backgrounds. Webb's transformation was perhaps the most dramatic, but also the most troubled. He stood slowly, removed his rank insignia, and offered a public apology that went beyond words to genuine recognition of moral failure. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute sincerity. Not just for what I said, but for what I failed to see. How can I make this right? But even as he spoke, part of Webb struggled with the implications of his apology. If he was wrong about Sarah, what else might he be wrong about? His entire worldview, built on the belief that military medicine was sacred and that suffering gave meaning to knowledge, was crumbling around him. The change was real, but it was also terrifying. Captain Rodriguez watched the proceedings with a mixture of satisfaction and concern. She had seen Sarah vindicated, but she had also seen the cost of that vindication. The woman who had stood so calmly through the initial humiliation now showed signs of deep exhaustion, the weight of exposure taking its toll. Elena made a decision that would define her career. She would stand with Sarah, not just as a colleague, but as someone who understood the unique challenges faced by women who had to prove themselves twice as hard in a male-dominated field. The symbolic moments that followed would be remembered by some as transformative, by others as staged. Webb formally apologized to the uniform itself, recognizing that his actions had dishonored not just Sarah, but everything the military medical corps represented. Sarah saluted the memorial wall of fallen comrades, her gesture carrying the weight of personal loss and professional dedication. General Hayes offered her a handshake between equals, the gesture carrying more significance than any formal ceremony. But the moment that revealed the true complexity of the situation came when Sarah showed brief vulnerability, a moment where the weight of her PTSD struggles showed through her professional composure. The room's protective instinct was immediate, but divided. Some genuinely moved by her humanity, others uncomfortable with the display of weakness from someone they were trying to view as a hero. The practical consequences were swift but incomplete. Sarah accepted a permanent position, her methods adopted as standard protocol in some units, while others remained skeptical. The cultural shift was uneven, with gender and civilian bias addressed through policy changes that Webb himself championed, but old attitudes die hard. His growth from enemy to ally was real but gradual, representing the kind of transformation that only comes from witnessing true heroism and the humbling recognition of one's own limitations. But the most powerful moment came when Sarah demonstrated advanced cardiac procedures on a training mannequin that represented the kind of injuries she had treated in that Afghan cave. Her hands moved with the precision of someone who had performed these procedures when every second counted, when the difference between life and death came down to skill, determination, and the refusal to accept defeat. As she worked, Captain Rodriguez noticed that Sarah's breathing had become more labored, her movements slightly less fluid. The cost of this exposure, of having her carefully constructed civilian life stripped away, was enormous. Elena stepped forward, ready to offer support, but Sarah shook her head slightly, a gesture that said she needed to finish this, to complete the demonstration that had become both vindication and exorcism. The transformation in the room was incredible to witness, but it was neither complete nor permanent. Some would leave that day forever changed, their understanding of heroism and service fundamentally altered. Others would struggle with the implications, their own military identities threatened by the recognition of civilian expertise. And a few would remain skeptical, their worldview too deeply ingrained to change in a single afternoon. But Sarah's final decision would surprise everyone, including herself, because sometimes the greatest victories come not from staying to claim recognition, but from knowing when the mission is complete and when the cost of that completion has been too high to sustain. The offer hung in the air like an unspoken prayer, 300 people holding their breath as they waited for Sarah's response. General Hayes had presented her with everything a military medical officer could want: full colonel equivalent rank, unlimited resources, the authority to revolutionize combat medicine training across all branches of service. The room buzzed with anticipation, everyone assuming that this was the moment of triumph, the happy ending where the hero claims her rightful place. But Sarah's response shattered every expectation. "I appreciate the offer, General, but I must decline." The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of confusion and disbelief throughout the amphitheater. General Hayes's face registered shock, then concern, as she tried to understand how someone could walk away from such an opportunity. Captain Rodriguez felt her heart sink as she watched Sarah's decision unfold. Elena had hoped that this moment would mark the beginning of a new chapter, that Sarah would stay and help change the culture that had treated her so poorly. But as she looked closer, she could see the exhaustion in Sarah's eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly as she gathered her materials. The cost of this exposure had been enormous, and Sarah was paying it in real time. The deeper truth emerged slowly, each revelation adding layers of complexity to a story that had already transcended simple heroism. Sarah had not come to Fort Braxton to reclaim her military career or to seek recognition for her service. She had come to heal, to prove to herself that she could face the military environment that had once defined her entire identity. Her mission had never been about teaching others, though that had become an unexpected gift. It had been about finding peace with the ghosts that had haunted her for 5 years. "My real purpose here was personal," Sarah explained, her voice carrying the weight of hard-won self-acknowledge. "I needed to know if I could stand in a room full of military personnel and not feel like I was drowning in memories. I needed to prove to myself that I could contribute something meaningful without wearing the uniform that once meant everything to me." Webb watched her explanation with growing understanding, but also with frustration. Here was a woman who had achieved everything he had aspired to, who had earned recognition beyond his wildest dreams, and she was walking away from it. Part of him wanted to argue, to convince her to stay and fight for the changes she could make, but another part of him recognized something he had never allowed himself to consider, that not everyone defined themselves by their military service, that heroism didn't require uniform or recognition. The revelation that followed struck the room like a physical blow. Sarah opened a manila folder that had been hidden in her medical bag, revealing laboratory reports that told a story darker than anyone had imagined. "I have cancer," she said simply, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the words. "Chemical exposure from the improvised surgeries in Afghanistan. The doctors give me 6 to 8 months." The silence that followed was profound and sacred, 300 people processing the reality that they were witnessing not just a hero's return, but possibly her farewell. Captain Rodriguez felt tears she hadn't shed in years threatening to fall. This explains so much: Sarah's urgency in teaching, her willingness to endure humiliation, her desperate need to prove that her knowledge could save lives. Webb's transformation reached a new level of complexity as he stepped forward, his voice thick with emotion. "Then we'll make sure those months count. Every resource, every facility, every person on this base is at your disposal." But even as he spoke, part of him struggled with the implications. Was his newfound respect genuine, or was it driven by guilt and pity? The question would haunt him long after Sarah left. Sarah's smile was the first genuine expression of joy anyone had seen from her since her arrival, but Captain Rodriguez noticed it didn't quite reach her eyes. "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say." Her plan unfolded with the precision of a military operation. She would design an intensive 3-month training program, condensing decades of combat medicine experience into a curriculum that could be replicated across the military medical system. Every technique would be documented, every innovation recorded, every hard-won lesson preserved for future generations. But the reality of implementing this vision would prove more challenging than anyone anticipated. The volunteer surge was immediate and overwhelming. 50 medics requested transfer to her program within hours. Senior officers volunteered to serve as teaching assistants. The base hospital offered its facilities for round-the-clock training sessions. What had begun as a confrontation had transformed into a movement, with Sarah at its center not as a commanding officer, but as a teacher whose time was precious beyond measure. Yet not everyone was ready to embrace this transformation. Some officers remained skeptical, questioning whether Sarah's methods were truly superior to established protocols. Others worried about the precedent being set. If one civilian contractor could revolutionize military medicine, what did that say about the existing system? The change was real, but it was also incomplete and fragile. Webb's redemption arc found its expression in quiet acts of service, but it was complicated by his own internal struggles. He cleared bureaucratic obstacles, arranged for her living quarters to be upgraded, ensured that her every need was met without fanfare or recognition. His daily gestures spoke louder than any formal apology. Coffee prepared exactly as she preferred, schedules cleared of unnecessary meetings, a standing order that Dr. Mitchell was to be given every courtesy and consideration. But Webb's nights were tormented by questions he couldn't answer. Had he changed because Sarah deserved respect, or because she was dying? Would he have treated her differently if she had been a healthy civilian contractor? The uncertainty gnawed at him, making his transformation feel less like growth and more like penance. Captain Rodriguez became Sarah's unofficial guardian and advocate, but she also struggled with her own motivations. Was she supporting Sarah because it was right, or because she saw an opportunity to advance her own career by aligning with a hero? The questions kept her awake at night, forcing her to confront the complex motivations that drove her actions. The ripple effects of Sarah's presence extended far beyond Fort Braxton, but they were uneven and sometimes contradictory. Her teaching methods spread to other bases through the informal networks that connect military medical personnel. Webb became an unlikely advocate for inclusive policies, his conversion from skeptic to champion carrying weight precisely because of his former position. But other commanders remained resistant, viewing the changes as an attack on military tradition. The cultural change was organic but incomplete, measured not in policy documents but in the changed attitudes of individuals who had witnessed authentic heroism. Some embraced the transformation wholeheartedly, others accepted it grudgingly, and a few rejected it entirely. The military, like any large institution, changed slowly and imperfectly. But the most powerful transformation was in Sarah herself. The woman who had arrived broken and searching for purpose had found something more valuable than recognition or rank. She had discovered that her true mission was not to heal from her trauma, but to transform it into something that could save lives. The cave in Afghanistan had taught her how to perform impossible surgery, but Fort Braxton had taught her how to heal wounds that went deeper than flesh. Yet even this healing was incomplete. Sarah's nightmares continued. Her grief over David's death remained a constant companion, and her struggle with PTSD was far from over. The recognition she had received was meaningful, but it couldn't undo the damage that had been done, or restore what had been lost. Her journey was one of progress, not perfection. 3 months later, the same amphitheater that had witnessed her humiliation became the site of her farewell. No formal ceremony had been planned, Sarah having requested that her departure be as quiet as her arrival. But word had spread through the informal channels that carry the most important military communications, and 500 personnel gathered voluntarily to honor her contributions. The moment that defined the entire experience came when Sarah entered the amphitheater for the last time. Without coordination, without command, the entire room stood in silent recognition. Webb saluted first, his gesture carrying the weight of personal transformation and professional respect, but also the uncertainty of someone still questioning his own motives. Others followed, not because they were ordered to, but because they understood they were witnessing something rare and precious. Captain Rodriguez watched the ceremony with mixed emotions. She was proud of the changes that had occurred, but she was also realistic about their limitations. The military medical system was better than it had been 3 months ago, but it was still far from perfect. The biases that had allowed Sarah's mistreatment hadn't disappeared overnight, and Elena knew that the fight for equality and recognition would continue long after Sarah left. Sarah's response was characteristically understated. She nodded once, acknowledging their respect without claiming it as her due, then walked toward the exit with the same quiet dignity that had carried her through every challenge. The uniform she wore, the same medical scrubs that had once marked her as an outsider, now seemed to embody everything noble about military service. But to those who looked closely, her exhaustion was visible. The cost of her time at Fort Braxton written in the lines around her eyes, and the careful way she moved. The final twist came in the form of a medical report that Sarah discovered in her files as she prepared to leave. The experimental treatment she had been receiving had worked better than anyone had dared hope. The cancer markers had decreased significantly, her prognosis extended from months to years, but her decision to leave remained unchanged, not because she was running from anything, but because she had accomplished what she came to do, and because the cost of that accomplishment had been higher than anyone realized. As Sarah walked away from Fort Braxton, her legacy was already taking root in the minds and hearts of those she had taught, but it was a complex legacy. Webb would spend the rest of his career implementing the changes she had inspired, but he would also struggle with questions about his own motivations and the nature of his transformation. The techniques she had developed would save countless lives in theaters of operation around the world, but they would also serve as a reminder of how much knowledge had been dismissed because of institutional bias. Captain Rodriguez would carry forward the lessons she had learned about advocacy and courage, but she would also remember the cost of change. How even victories in the fight for recognition and equality came with a price that was often paid by those who could least afford it. The cultural shift at Fort Braxton was real, but it was also fragile, requiring constant vigilance to maintain. Most importantly, the lessons Sarah had embodied would continue to resonate, but it would resonate differently for different people. Some would remember her as proof that heroes walk among us unrecognized, while others would question whether the system that had failed to recognize her heroism had truly changed. Her story would become both inspiration and cautionary tale, a reminder that progress is possible but never guaranteed. The empty podium behind her seemed to symbolize everything she had taught them about leadership, but it also represented the questions that remained unanswered. Real heroes do not need pedestals or recognition, but they also shouldn't have to endure humiliation and bias to prove their worth. They simply do what needs to be done, teach what needs to be learned, and trust that their impact will ripple outward long after they are gone, even when that impact is complicated, imperfect, and incomplete. Sarah's story proves that heroes walk among us unrecognized, but it also proves that recognition, when it comes, doesn't always heal the wounds that invisibility creates. Her journey from civilian contractor to acknowledged hero was powerful, but it was also painful, costly, and ultimately bittersweet. The most profound victories are indeed often the ones nobody sees coming, and the greatest teachers are those who transform pain into purpose, silence into strength, and service into something that endures, even when that endurance is fragile and the transformation is incomplete. Because sometimes the most important stories are not about perfect heroes or complete redemption, but about flawed people trying to do better, about institutions slowly changing, and about the complex, difficult work of healing wounds that run deeper than any surgery can reach. Sarah's legacy would live on, but it would live on in all its complexity, a reminder that even the most powerful victories come with costs, and that the greatest courage is often found not in the moment of triumph, but in the quiet determination to keep serving despite everything that tries to break us.
Hi, mình là Daisy đây. Mình hy vọng tập này của series A Simple Woman đã chạm đến trái tim của các bạn. Thật lòng, mình rất cảm kích tất cả các bạn đã ủng hộ kênh. Hãy share cho bạn bè nếu cảm thấy tập này ý nghĩa nhé.